tempted to say our next two presenters are rogues, but Kurt Schaefer and Heath Clarkston come from Lathrop GPM Consulting, the firm's government relations subsidiary, and both are in our Jefferson City office. I will note that we had hoped to have Darren Macbeth, part of our very strong government relations team in Minneapolis, but he was called away for client work. We will still be addressing some Minnesota issues in the presentation. COVID has not only kept them busy with new issues, but has presented challenges on how to do business with much more limited personal contact with legislators and other public officials. But the relationships built from years in the Capitol have allowed these guys to still get the job done. Heath and Kurt, take it away.
Good morning. I think I'm the first slide up. Again, and thank you, Jean Paul. I'm Heath Clarkston. I'm based out of the Jefferson City, Missouri office. I have 20 plus years of lobbying experience in Missouri. A lobbyist does a lot of things, so our relationships go from the county level to the local level, to trade associations, to you name it, groups across the country. And I began many years ago with a trade organization dealing with large manufacturing. Worked for many years with a gentleman by the name of Harry Gallagher with Gallagher Consultants, and I was fortunate enough to merge into a new entity with Lathrop as Lathrop GPM Consulting, along with Kurt Schaefer. And we have another partner, Doug Nelson, who could not be on today, but has a wealth of knowledge as well. Kurt, maybe you can do your introduction.
Sure. Next slide, please. So hello, everybody. I'm Kurt Schaefer. I'm a partner with the law firm in the Jefferson City office, and I've been a lawyer with Lathrop for over 20 years. But in addition to that, in my previous life, I was a former assistant attorney general, a former special assistant U.S. attorney, general counsel to the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, and then more recently, from 2008 to 2016, I was a Missouri state senator. We have term limits in Missouri, so you only get 2 terms for 4 years apiece, so 8 years total. And when I was term limited out in 2016, Jean Paul Bradshaw, who introduced us, and I had talked about the fact that really, you know, in addition to being a law firm, we're really in the problem-solving business. And sometimes those problems get solved by going to court and litigating. Sometimes those are out-of-court settlements. But sometimes they involve other things, such as lobbying a legislature, the executive branch, a state agency. And that's something that really, for problem solving for a client, need to be on the table to make sure that you're doing everything you can for a client. So when I was term limited out in 2016, we started Lathrop Gage Consulting at the time, now Lathrop GPM Consulting. And the one thing that I do, in addition to still litigating, mostly in the areas of environmental law and agricultural law with the firm, is I do lobbying both for the executive branch and the legislative branch, as well as crisis consultation and other issues wherever a client needs help in communication with sometimes a state governmental entity, sometimes a federal. We were asked to put a little bit of a comment on how COVID has affected us, and that's my bottom bullet point there. And one thing I have really noticed is for responding to COVID, all the new regulations that have come from both the state level and the federal level, is it really does show the more government imposes regulation, the more those impacted by those regulations need to make sure that they've got a voice in the appropriate place so that their interests are protected. Next slide, please. So what we do at Lathrop Consulting, as I said, is, you know, people think of lobbyists, and we do lobbying, and a lot of times they think that means lobbying a legislature. And that's certainly part of it, but we also lobby the executive branch, which would be the governor all the way down to the state agencies. And one thing in my experience in this field, being around government for over 25 years, is the issue of, you can call it lobbying at a regulatory level, where you're dealing with state agencies while they're promulgating regulations under the authority of a statute. And those regulations may fill in the blanks, for example, on how a statute gets carried out, could have a tremendous effect on your business, and participation with those agencies in the notice and comment period and other ways of communication really can help a client make sure that when those regulations get promulgated, the industry, the agency that's attempting to affect an industry understands what that industry is. Our team is headquartered in Jefferson City, and we got a little picture of us there. Kim Aiken is all the way on the left. David Shore, who's the next one to the right, is our partner in charge of the Jeff City office. He is also a lawyer. Doug Nelson, as Heath mentioned previously, is the third one from the left. Doug is the previous OA commissioner for the state of Missouri. And most states have a position like that, which is essentially the CEO and the CFO for the governor of a given state. And what that really means is that person is usually in charge of procurement for their given state. And that's one thing that Doug Nelson does with us. And he was, before leaving state government, was head of the Federal Association of State Officers in the same position as him. So procurement really is his expertise. And then that's me. Doug Cruz, who works with us, is the former president of the Missouri Press Association. Harry Gallagher, as Heath mentioned, who is one of the longest serving lobbyists in the state of Missouri. And then on the far right is Heath. Our website is there. We have a very short time period today. We're not going to be able to cover everything, but I did want to direct everyone to our website. You can see the full services that we offer. And we try, in addition to explaining the things that we do, try and put out client alerts and other things as we see legislation coming down the road that our clients may be interested in. Next slide, please.
I think we have a poll question too, Kurt.
Oh, do we have a poll question? Let's see the poll question.
Lighten up the presentation.
All right, yeah. There's our poll question. Who said no man's life, liberty, or property are safe while the legislature is in session? And while everyone on this list may think that, what we're looking for is the person who is actually credited with saying that for the first time. So we'll let everybody answer that. I do want to point out also that while our partners in Minneapolis could not be on this call, Darren Macbeth is a longtime lobbyist and lawyer in our Minneapolis office. Brian Carr works with him. And as I've explained, the things that we do, they do those as well. They lobby the legislature, they lobby the executive branch, as well as state agencies, and even on the local level, counties and municipalities, to the extent that those services are necessary to make sure that information for a client is communicated to the right person. Next slide, please. Heath, I think that's you.
Yeah, so a lot of inquiries are coming in into our office and talking with the Minnesota office as well on what's going on the federal level. Obviously, the states are following the guidelines set by the federal government and Congress when they've done the first 3 rounds of stimulus. Right now, there's a debate that is in a kind of a stagnant mode right now. The House and the U.S. Senate are so far apart, and the president also has a different position. But I thought I'd go over it. The United States House in May passed the HEROES Act, which contained numerous provisions. Probably the biggest item of contention is in the House version. They have funding going to local governments, county governments, and state governments. The U.S. Senate Republican caucus generally believes those are bailouts for some of the states who mishandled their funds. However, I do think that will be part of the final plan in some variation. The president has been talking about finding funds for public education, K through 12. Obviously, if you followed the anything in the news, you know that there's a big push to get kids in school in person, and I think that's part of the president's plan as part of this round 4. But in regard to the queries we're getting from our office, from our business clients, some of them all center around the extension of the enhanced unemployment benefit. As many of you know, there was an additional $600 added to the typical employment benefits in the last round. The House is seeking to continue the current program, while the U.S. Senate is wanting to do something scaled back. It's been rumored to be $200 in addition, but the real goal would be 70% of your income. The problem with that is these funds pass through down to the state, and the states across the country have to administer them, and they don't have the technology and the software available to do a plan where it would equate 70% of your income. So right now, many believe the easiest thing to do is to keep it at a hard dollar amount. Another piece to this would resemble what they did in the last stimulus round with a direct payment to taxpayers at $1,200 or $1,200 or $2,400 for a couple. Obviously, there's income thresholds that if you exceed, you will not get those benefits. The big ones are an extension of the Paycheck Protection Program, which obviously is on round 2, going on round 3 if this happens, so it's been widely used. They're wanting to do things to help small businesses in this round, and that is part of both the House and the Senate versions. We look for them to streamline forgiveness for some of the smaller loans under $1 million. They want to do something for farmers, and there's other programs that they want to potentially incorporate that are really divided between the House and the Senate. But the U.S. Congress likes to use acronyms, so I will use their acronyms. One is the ERTC, that's the Employment Retention Tax Credit, and another is the EIDL, and that's the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. We don't know what's going to ultimately come out of that. The House version was $3 trillion. That the Senate version is a $1.5 trillion. So I don't know where it goes. Maybe 10 trillion. It's a joke. If you see the cheese on the top right corner, I'm talking about, you know, the government cheese. Lastly, I would say that COVID liability, and I know last week's presentation, we talked quite a bit about that. That is the centerpiece of the U.S. Senate's request to get a project done for round 4, is to give realistic COVID liability protections to businesses. I do think that will be part of the deal. I don't know how extensive it'll be, but if you have any questions, please go ahead and send them to the chat feature. And if we have some time at the end, we'll try to answer them. But I think to keep things moving, maybe we can go to the next slide. And the next slide is talking a little bit about what happened in the Missouri legislature in 2020. We had a very, very odd year, just as many other states. We took a 5-week recess in March due to the COVID pandemic. And ultimately, the legislative leadership decided to come back in the final 3 weeks to pass a balanced operating budget for the next fiscal year, which is a little bit over $31 billion. And then they also passed several bills. So in 2020, we had 2,260 bills filed in the legislature, which makes it part of our jobs to just basically keep track of what's going on. And that's a lot of legislation, 2,260 bills. Of those, 51 reached the governor's desk. So that was a pretty progressive year for dealing with the COVID pandemic. The first issue I had up there is a general tax reform bill. For those on the call that live in St. Louis County, St. Louis City, or Jackson County, there were significant reforms on the way your property is assessed. It basically puts an end to drive-by assessments. The taxpayer basically wins on appeal if the assessor cannot prove they didn't do just a drive-by assessment. So that's a big win. There's a burden of proof on the assessor now versus the taxpayer. They made some changes to the partnership rules. And lastly, I know I'm going fairly quickly here, they exempted any tax or any stimulus funds received from state income tax. So if you received $1,200 or $2,400, it was tax-free. Kurt, you want to hit on tort reform?
Sure, I'll take up Senate Bill 591. So in the state of Missouri, we do have a majority of Republicans controlling the Missouri House and the Missouri Senate. And for the last several years, they've made it a point to make tort reform one of their top priorities. So every year for the last several years, there's usually 1 or 2 tort reform bills that get passed. This concept that's encompassed in Senate Bill 591, which passed this year, has been on the table the last couple of years. This was the year that it was moved really forward to be the key piece of tort reform legislation. It was passed by the General Assembly towards the end of the session, as he said, in May. It was signed by the governor. And all of these bills in the state of Missouri will go into effect August 28th. Missouri's legislative session is January to May. Some states are different. Most states have a period, usually in winter and spring, similar to Missouri. But anything that does not have an emergency clause attached to it, which would make it go into effect at the time the governor signs it, generally goes into effect on August 28th. And so this Senate Bill 591, which is going to change cases, not cases that are pending, but cases that get filed in court after August 28th, it will have an impact on how punitive damages are handled by the courts. And I want to add a caveat to that, because I'll talk in a minute about some of the changes that were passed about 15 years ago in terms of punitive damages and tort reform. But just as it was then, it is now, the court will interpret ultimately what these statutes mean. And sometimes the legislature will pass these tort reform bills thinking that they fixed a problem that they perceive in how certain court cases proceed. And ultimately, the court will be the arbiter of what that language means and how it gets implemented. So, for example, on Senate Bill 591, one of the first things it does is it changes the procedure for how punitive damage cases are brought. Right now, when you bring a punitive damage claim along with your other claims, whether that be nuisance, negligence, some other common law or statutory claim that you bring, you allege punitive damages along with your regular claim when you file it. And about 15 years ago, the legislature passed a provision that said, well, the court still has to make a determination at some point early in that case whether or not it's sufficient in the allegations of punitive damages for that claim to go forward. It was believed at that time by the legislature that that threshold that the court had to look at whether or not there was sufficient evidence to go forward would be kind of a gatekeeping function. And what that really turned out to be is more of just a perfunctory look at by the court of what's in the pleading, and not really what the General Assembly intended for it to be more of a gatekeeping function. So one of the provisions of Senate Bill 591 changes that pleading requirement. And what it says is when you file your lawsuit now, you don't allege punitive damages in your initial pleading. At some point after the case is filed, and there's some language about when that is based on when your pretrial conferences are, you have to file a motion to add punitive damages to your case. And then the court has to make a determination of whether or not there is sufficient evidence to go forward. And it really is treated much more like a motion. It's intended to be treated much more like a motion for summary judgment of whether or not punitive damages will be part of that case. Again, we'll have to see how the courts interpret this and whether or not it really creates that gatekeeping function that the legislature intended. But additionally, Senate Bill 591 makes it clear that the standard for bringing punitive damages, for maintaining the claim in that first step, as well as prevailing on punitive damage, is a clear and convincing standard. And there's been some ambiguity in that. The Missouri Supreme Court has pretty much made it clear that it probably is clear and convincing as opposed to the lower standard of a preponderance of the evidence. This statute, which will go into effect August 28th in the form of Senate Bill 591, will make it clear. It is clear and convincing. So it is a articulated higher standard in the statute to bring and maintain a punitive damage claim. The other, probably the biggest change that Senate Bill 591 makes is it takes negligence out of the equation. To get punitive damages and prevail on a punitive damage claim now, after this goes into effect, you have to establish that the defendant's conduct was intentional. And so there are some situations where punitive damages can be based on negligence. Now, essentially, you will have to establish, if you are a plaintiff, that the evidence establishes that the defendant's actions are intentional, either intentionally malicious or with an intentional disregard to the impact it would have, knowing the impact that it would have on the plaintiff. It is a much higher standard. And so in addition to those changes generally for all punitive damages cases, Missouri has the Missouri Merchandising Practices Act, which, like all other states, is a consumer protection statute. In almost all states, they are enforced both by the Attorney General of a given state, as well as having citizen suit provisions or private party enforcement by somebody who, if they are wronged in a consumer transaction, can bring those cases themselves. And so what you see in Missouri and other states is most of the time when you see some of these larger class action lawsuits, they are actually brought under, in Missouri, the Missouri Merchandising Practices Act, or in another state under their similar consumer protection statute. So in addition to those general requirements for punitive damage pleadings and standards of evidence that I just talked about, for the Merchandising Practices Act, Senate Bill 591 also makes it clear that You can no longer bring a Merchandising Practices Act case for anything related to the sale of a new house or household. That's a carve that was put in there, I'm assuming, by the realtors. And then on top of that, you now have to establish that the plaintiff bringing the case acted reasonably in the consumer transaction. That was not previously a standard that the plaintiff had to meet. And additionally, the attorney's fees on a class action under the Merchandising Practices Act now have to be based on the level of damages received by the plaintiffs. So this is attempting, but the legislature attempting to address the circumstance where you see, somebody buys a consumer product that's worth $10, and you may have a plaintiff's attorney who goes out there and finds 1,000 people who bought this product, and if they prevail that somehow there was fraudulent activity or something wrong in the consumer transaction, each plaintiff may get $10 back or maybe less than that on that transaction, but the lawyer gets fees much, much higher than that. In other words, usually 1/3 of the total amount that all plaintiffs get. There is language in Senate Bill 591 that's aimed at trying to rein that in and keep the attorney's fees commensurate with what the actual plaintiffs receive in terms of their own damages, as well as requiring each plaintiff to show the relationship of the damages to them personally. And I think that that's a curious one. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of a larger general class action suit when there's language now in the Merchandising Practices Act that requires each individual plaintiff to establish their own damages. Heath, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, and I'll move. I know we're running a little behind here. So House Bill 1655 was probably one of the bigger issues of the session that wasn't highly controversial, but was necessary. During the COVID pandemic, many counties and cities across the state closed for various reasons, and mainly because to stop the spread of COVID. So that affected the real estate industry, that affected wills, trusts, estates. Missouri is one of the few states that has not had an electronic notary or electronic signature program within the Secretary of State's office. So the governor actually put in an executive order to allow this to occur, and the legislature in the remaining weeks of session basically codified in statute what the Secretary of State was hoping to do in regulation, and therefore now we have an electronic notary program. It's working, it's up and running. We published an article on it that you can reach from the link below. Next slide. I will go quickly over Minnesota, as unfortunately Darren couldn't be here today, but I know their biggest issue going on right now is everything COVID related. They're in and out of special session regularly. They may be in one today, I'm not sure, but they are dealing with COVID through their legislature in a different way than Missouri did. Missouri did the final remaining weeks of session. They're going issue by issue in Minnesota. Darren also wanted me to mention that, Minnesota is a unique state. They have a politically divided legislature, one chamber Republican, one chamber Democrat with a Democrat governor. Missouri had that a few years back with a Republican legislature and a Democrat governor, and it is a challenge to govern that way. But if you see down further in their notes here, they expect the potential of having a total Democrat General Assembly and a Democrat governor. So things may be changing in Minnesota policy-wise. Some of their threats you can see below are a statewide paid family leave employer mandate, issues on nurse staffing ratios, renewable energy mandates, and they also talked about some opportunities, which you can see below. I would like to add one thing that I know a lot about the Minnesota firm, and they do a lot of work on political action committees, continuing committees. So they're very involved in anything dealing with on the political side as well. So if you're in Minnesota and needing guidance, they're a great team for that. The next slide is what's going on in Missouri over the interim. Right now, we are technically in a special session. It started on Monday. Governor Mike Parson called the legislature back to address violent crime. There are 6 provisions in that. It has been fairly non-controversial to date, but they have not had floor debate. They've only had committee hearings. The legislature is adjourned for the remainder of the week. The Senate will come back next week after Tuesday's primary election. and take up the bill, and then it'll go to the House the next week. One thing I would mention that I'm hearing, and there's no way to know this because decisions have not been made, but there may be an additional session coming, a special session in later in the year dealing with COVID liability. Now saying that, as I mentioned earlier, the federal government's looking at doing this as well. So the wind may go out of the sails for states to take up COVID liability dependent upon what the federal government does. But most of Missouri's surrounding states have addressed this issue. And to keep things moving, you'll notice there's a link below. The firm put together a topic of COVID liability where we talk about our surrounding states outside of Missouri and what Missouri could be doing. So you might want to check that out. I will also mention, it's on the next slide, but there has been discussions about a special session centering around the collection of online sales taxes, often referred to as the Wayfair decision. But that's also probably going to be pushed back to the January session as it has some controversy.
All right, I'll take up the rest of this slide. So obviously we have general election on the 3rd. Our governor in Missouri is up for election, as well as about half the Senate seats and all of the House seats. And while I don't believe that the control of the House or the Senate will change from Republicans, our Republican governor was pretty set, as were a lot of governors before COVID started, and there's a lot of uncertainty now, so it's hard to tell how that race will come out. So obviously any agenda for the next legislative session, which will start in January, is going to play into who wins these elections. And I think that with a lot of the uncertainty that we're seeing around the country right now, some of these races, from the local races all the way to the presidential race, get very, very difficult to predict because the norms that usually people use to predict races simply don't exist anymore. So we'll see how those shake out. Other things we see for the upcoming session, we do have on the ballot in the state of Missouri Medicaid expansion, which a lot of states did on their own, some with a vote, some through legislative activity. Missouri was one of those states that did not do Medicaid expansion. If that passes, it will have a tremendous impact on the state budget. At a minimum, it's $200 million to cover the additional approximately 200,000 people that will go on Medicaid that are not on it currently. And then there will be a lot of back and forth on how additional federal Medicaid money comes to the state of Missouri. So that will create a lot of uncertainty and a lot of hand-wringing probably in the budget process next year. As Heath mentioned, collection of online sales tax, which again, some states have addressed. Missouri has not, to deal with the U.S. Supreme Court's Wayfair decision. I suspect when you see revenues dropping, especially at the local level and state level in states just like Missouri, there's going to be a lot of pressure to probably get that passed. Gaming and sports betting, that obviously has been a hot topic the last couple of years in the legislature in the state of Missouri. That will come up again. Just as our previous speakers mentioned, COVID liability will also be a big one, especially for healthcare providers, not only hospitals, but especially nursing homes. And then transportation infrastructure funding, which tends to be an issue every year, but is really coming to a head with some of the more major highways that go through the state of Missouri and provide interstate commerce, yet are in terrible shape. Next slide, please. Let's see. One thing I did want to point out, and I think we're running low on time, but one issue that I mentioned that we do at Lathrop GPM Consulting is we do work with executive agencies. And again, some people think of lobbying as only being with the legislature. A lot of what we do is dealing with state agencies, and we've got some listed here. For example, we have many clients who interact with the Department of Natural Resources on fees. Those are generally done by stakeholder group, and having your voice heard in those agency meetings and those stakeholder groups is extremely important for helping shape public policy. We're running low on time, so I will let that go. But before we get to our poll question, I do want to mention that, all of this brings to mind, it's a Seinfeld episode where Jerry Seinfeld's making fun of lawyers. And one thing he says is lawyers are the people that when you're playing Monopoly actually read the directions on the back of the box top. And that is true, because lawyers do read the back of the box top. But what I have to remind my lawyer friends is somebody wrote the directions on the back of the box top. And sometimes you can work to fix client problems within what's on the back of the box top, but sometimes that box top was written 50 years ago and doesn't even fit the technology that exists today, and something else is needed to solve that problem. And that's really what we try and do at Lathrop GPM Consulting. Keith, and I think you've got some poll results.
Yeah, and before that, I don't know who all voted for Jimmy Buffett, but if you did, his quote would have been, without geography, you're nowhere. But he's not the right answer. Can we see the result? Wow, we got
That's
a lot
good.
of Missourians on this one. Yeah,
That's pretty good.
Mark Twain made that quote. It's probably been one of the most quoted things in the Missouri Capitol. I could see Ted Cruz saying it still today. With that, if you have any questions that are stuff we didn't cover, I know our emails are on the next two slides, and you know, we'd be happy to respond. And we'd just really like to say thank you for bearing with us this afternoon. Things are just evolving on the legislative front, and as these federal laws continue to pass, they send the money to the states. And as Kurt kind of skipped over at the very end, we have a working group dealing with the federal funding coming in, and it's changing by the minute. So feel free to reach out to us anytime. Appreciate the opportunity today, Gene Paul.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.